Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
One of the most common things you hear in the Alexander technique world is this idea of good use or bad use. And Alexander names one of his books, The Use of the Self. So can you talk about what is good use? What are the criteria we would use for knowing whether someone has good use or not? And how is your understanding of use different from what is normally used in the modern Alexander technique world?
Yes, it's a very important question because we are teacher, we have a responsibility regarding our students and pupils to, in fact, found our teaching on some stable ground. So before going into explaining what is my idea of good use, what is the criteria the pupil should use in order to develop good use, I think it's better to start with FM Alexander. And on that subject, what he does is really strange. He starts with a statement that the criterion is whether you are able to change what you want to change. So if you're able to change what you want to change, so he says there are physical habits. And we know that for now, for us, it's very clear that physical habits are the result of faulty guidance, which is a mental direction of the movements of the different parts of the mechanisms. So it's clear that for him, we are talking about mental habits. And so he starts with this idea, and then I can't understand, you will see, he completely change a gear and goes on to saying that through the experiences of learning his technique, his pupil get, well, a feeling criterion of what is good use. And this, I think, was the start of the trend of the modern Alexander technique, which I call the somatic technique. And that's how he started the fact that's, well, transformation of a conscious guidance and control technique into a somatic technique. So I want to bring you into this kind of reasoning before I, in fact, show you how it is in the initial Alexander technique that I teach. So let's go. We are discussing, in fact, a chapter that is in the use of the self in the third book. And so the best way, it's the third chapter about diagnostic, if you want to find it. And so the first thing I need to do is to share with you my screen so that you can see what I'm working with. So that's how the chapter starts. I've been asked whether the technique I advocate is applicable to cases of people who are anxious, not so much to remedy a so-called physical defect, but to overcome or change what they think as the mental or nervous troubles, including bad habits of all kinds, as they realize that as long as they cannot control these, they are not getting the best out of themselves. My answer is that the fact that these people are unable to make a change within themselves, which they have reasoned out would be a desirable change, shows that their reaction to the stimulus to gain this end is an unsatisfactory reaction, and that this brings their case at once into line with that of the golfer who cannot keep his eyes on the ball when he wishes to, and of the stutterer who cannot speak as he desires. So from that introduction, I started with the idea that fine, the criterion of good use of the self, you have to remember the use. It's the manner of employment of a number of mechanisms. Well, the criterion is whether you can make change. We can change whatever you desire, whatever you have reason as desirable. Of course, not whatever you desire, whatever you have reason as desirable. So when he talks about these mental defects, he mentioned inability to concentrate, to give its mind to the work. He talks about undue emotional reactions. Is so this is quite interesting, and we understand that if a person becomes capable of directing different mental objects at the same time, converging to a same consequence, the same conclusion, well, that person, of course, has learned ways to direct the mind. So therefore, the person will be able to apply the mind to any personal problems. And so that in itself is was a real discovery for me. Learning to command, learning to order the mind in order to solve a physical problem was no different from learning to, for example, he talks about a mental disease that most people have today is, for example, they can't sit for more than 10 minutes without showing such an agitation that they are always constantly moving. So when I start giving lessons to pupils through the internet, we are looking at each other, we are discussing some matters, and it's very easy to see lessons after lessons how the person is going to, well, become quieter in the sense as quieter in the number of movements that the person perform in 1 minute, but also much more mentally alert. And how do you note if a person is mentally alert? Well, it's very simple. I give orders of movements. I give orders all the time. And the person has to understand what it is I mean before moving. So it's very simple to see whether the person is able to really catch on. I say to one person, could you please point the right index finger toward the left knee? So the person has to remember what I've said. The person must translate what I've said. And after a few minutes, the person may, well, suddenly discover that she cannot remember which hand it was, which leg. Was it the right or the left knee? Of course, it was the left knee, I said. But being alert, being able to manipulate many ideas at the same time, to keep one idea in mind while you're still speaking, for example, is something that is absolutely useful in life. And it goes, okay, with this work of coordinating the different movement of the parts. It's a fundamental aspect, but it's trained through the discovery that one can guide the use of the self with instructions. So fine, we have here a statement where Alexander said that if the use of the self you employ is making you capable of analyzing any problem, any new problem that you discover in your own behavior, well, that is the right use. That's the first statement. But then you will find that it goes on to something else. And the demonstration starts with the idea that there is a right use of the physical mechanisms. So let's go and see how this is well introduced by Alexander. Where the use of the self is concerned, there is a standard which can generally be accepted, for it can be demonstrated that a certain manner of use of the mechanism is found in association with a certain satisfactory standard of functioning and with condition of health and general well-being. We are surely justified in considering a manner of use that is associated with such desirable conditions to be natural or right under all circumstances. So now Alexander is shifting the focus. He started with the very general idea that training a person to use the mind would make the person capable of changing some habits in the behavior, and that was a criterion of good use. If you can use yourself in such a way as to change your bad habits, you have good use. Yeah, but of course, to train a person to use the mind, you need some background, and the background Alexander is using is the real movements of the different parts of the mechanism. So we have the use of the self in general, and here we use the self in order to readjust faulty movements, to readjust undesirable activities. And it was quite interesting because we have some films of Alexander, and I started to look at what was the mechanical result, what was the geometry, if you want, of the change Alexander promoted. Alexander, as we've already seen many times, was working with the central mechanism of the torso. And so I started to observe how he was promoting a new use of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism of the torso. And so in this sentence, there is something that is troubling, that has been troubling me all the time, is the fact that Alexander says that it can be demonstrated that a certain use of the mechanism is found in association with satisfactory standard of functioning. And because you have to ask yourself in a technique of conscious guidance and control, what it is we are talking about when we say that we can demonstrate that a certain manner of use of the mechanism is promoting satisfactory standard of functioning. And well, that question arises because in the somatic technique, this is not a question. This is absolutely simple. What is demonstrated is that when the teacher is manipulating the pupil suddenly feels better. The general well-being as perceived by the student or the pupil receiving the manipulation is increased. The person feels light. The person feels free of problems. So you might say, well, that's it. The person has changed some habits, and obviously the manner of use, the new manner of use, is correct. Well, that is highly problematic, really, because it can be seen, and I've seen that very many times when a good manipulator will touch a pupil. Very often, the pupil will receive a fantastic sensory experience. But if you observe the organization of the movements of the different parts, there are two things that are absolutely stunning and disturbing, is that most often nowadays, the shape and form of the torso of the person has not really changed, or if there was a change, and you will find that the change is completely different to the one you see on screen at the moment. This is a still photograph taken from the film, taken in 1951, where Alexander is working with this young man, and it's absolutely obvious that Alexander is working the whole 10 minutes in order to get a result that is the one that is starting to look and that you can see on screen now. And you will find that when there are lessons of modern Alexander technique. I've already shown you all these pictures that are taken from the internet, where the modern Alexander technique is in fact marketed. You discover an organization of the movement of the different parts of the torso that have absolutely nothing to do with what Alexander is promoting in his own video. It's you see what I call the straight back picture. Yeah, if you compare with what Alexander can demonstrate, he gives an ocular demonstration of an organization of the torso, of the rib cage, for example. The rib cage poise is completely different. And so this is troubling me. This was troubling me from the start. How could it be that the use of the mechanism is so different and that the pupil that is receiving the treatment, if you want, the manipulation, feels so light? How is it that when the person goes away from that turn, that lesson with the senior teacher, the person goes with a glow in the face, with wow, the person is still feeling so much better, when in fact, the different movements of the parts are back to habitual. The person has not made any change. That was really troubling me. And so from there, we will go on to even more difficult passage, where Alexander says that he says further, the experiences involved in acquiring a knowledge of such right and natural use of the self gives a person a criterion of judgment to go by, and also an understanding of relative value, for in this process is constantly brought up against situation in which, after receiving a stimulus, he has to decide what manner of use is best to employ in reacting to it, and also to judge which of the direction for his manner of use is primary, which secondary, and so on. So Alexander is saying that during his lessons, his pupil acquire a knowledge of right and natural use of the self. The question is, when I started my training course, I suddenly discovered that the knowledge we were talking about in the modern Alexander technique was somatic. That is, we were taught in a somatic way by direct imprinting. That is, the teacher would move the different parts while we were going up and down to sit on the chair, or when we were, for example, leaning forward. And there was no understanding of relative values in that. The value was that the use was right because it was given by a teacher, and all we had to do was to associate some certain instructions with the feeling that we were experiencing while the teacher was moving the different parts. And suddenly it was like a schizophrenia, because on the one side, Alexander talks about effectively a mental technique where conscious guidance and control of the mind with instruction leads to a series of instructions of movements, which combined together provide a result that is new, that is unknown, that is going to be felt as wrong. So that's one side of his theory. And on the other side, there was this somatic technique, and the real criterion that I found is the criterion of judgment that people had was the tabletop. It was a somatic criterion. It was considered that lying down on the floor with the back against the floor and a few books beneath the head, in different schools, for example, in the Patrick MacDonald School, they tended to have less and less books, yes, to get, now a geometrical criterion for the use of the mechanism of the torso that, according to Alexander, according to his writings, was wrong. That was incredible. If you look at the person lying down, this is a stat advertisement. So it's the real thing. It's not something I've construed. It's not something that I've made up. No. We see that the front of the upper chest is unduly lifted. It's exactly what Alexander pointed out as the start of all the problems. When the front of the chest is unduly lifted, there is an undue positioning of the rib cage. The poise of the rib cage is all wrong. It's opening the front ribs and protruding the abdomen. So the person may, of course, may make a lot of efforts because I consider that to get a straight back like this one, you have to make a lot of conscious efforts, really, because in order to maintain this unduly lift, because the unduly lift, I know it's maintained without seeing it, because we can see that the upper chest is very far back. Remember Alexander hump, the fact that when the rib cage is rotated so that the sternum bone is vertical, remember that then, of course, the first thoracic vertebrae is going to have to be rotated very far forward and up. With this rotation of the thoracic cage, we have the spine, the thoracic spine rotating. Therefore, we have, well, the cervical spine rotating forward and up. And this, and only this, places the head forward and up. So it's really by readjusting the movements of the middle and upper torso, one relatively to the other. It's through the readjustment of the mechanism of the torso that the neck is set free and that the head can go forward and up. Otherwise, in this case, the neck is absolutely not free. You must imagine how much the person has to, in fact, maintain the upper chest backward. And so we see that in order to do that, the shoulders are really pushed back. The shoulders are nearly on the line of the back. Yes? So when the shoulders are going backward, the shoulder blades are going toward the spine. So this is what we call narrowing the upper back. The person is narrowing the upper back right here. And this is, I think, a continuation of a criterion. It's a geometrical criterion, or you would say a structural criterion that the person is gaining from a simple table. This has very little to do with conscious guidance and control of the movements of the parts of the torso. The person is not consciously controlling the poise of the rib cage. The poise of the rib cage is just obtained by a release onto gravity against a hard surface. How could that, in fact, have any sort of relationship with what Alexander is promoting? Well, it's very difficult to tell. And then I started to, I've already shown this kind of comparison. This is Alexander on the right, and this is Marjorie Barlow on the left. For me, the geometrical criterion is obvious. It is absolutely clear that Alexander is creating conscious movements in order to simplify the use of the spine. It's absolutely clear that the back is going back and that the upper chest is going forward and up. As a result, Alexander is, in fact, using all the movements of the upper chest, of the shoulders that are, as you see, very far from the back. Remember the lady that had this habit of going on the floor? Her shoulders, of course, were released backward. She was narrowing the upper back. Well, it's absolutely obvious that Alexander is not. He's widening the upper back, and I know it from at first glance, just because I can see the line of the lower back and I can see the front of the shoulder. They are the difference in them is immense. So when you look at a senior modern Alexander teacher, suddenly you wonder, you think, what is the criterion she's using in order to employ the mechanism of the torso in the task? She's in fact touching the head of someone that is lying down. She, she said herself, I am a lying down person. She said, I'm not a wall person. Her husband was a wall person. By that, we are discussing by wall person or semi-supine person or lying down person, we are talking about different procedures. The first procedure was the wall procedure. Many students, including Marjorie Barlow, said that they were performing the wall procedure every single day in the first training course. But she was not a wall person. She liked lying down. So you find that after lying down for so many years, the geometrical result, the use of the mechanism of the torso is absolutely different, yes, from the use promoted by FM Alexander. So this started to become for me a problem to solve. And filming myself, I started to realize that I really didn't know how to perform a geometry similar to the one Alexander was performing. I was missing any sort of geometrical criterion. How could I approach what he was doing? It was obvious to me that lying down on the floor was a con. It was not working. It was not promoting the change. So Alexander said, if you have good use, you can promote change. And I found that, well, the experiences I had received that were involved in acquiring the knowledge of the modern Alexander technique did not allow me to change the use of my mechanism of the torso. It was obvious when I was filmed that when I was putting hands, when I was doing things, my organization of the mechanism of the torso tended to the unduly lifted front part of the chest, the abdomen protruding, and I was not the only one. It was not a personal problem. I started to observe around me, and I've got some pictures. I've taken two that are from two opposite sides of the world. These are pictures that you can find on the internet. And so you find two persons that are doing something in the Alexander technique that is well known. That is, they want to obtain a position of mechanical advantage in order to place their hands on the head of a person that is lying down in front of them. So this is sometimes called monkey or position of mechanical advantage in flexion. And when you look at it, you see exactly the same shape. These are completely different schools. They are not the same school. And what you see are defects of movements Alexander pointed out in his books. And so an undue lifting of the front part of the chest, the shortening and the narrowing of the back, that is more or less pronounced. Equilibrium difficulties also, and so it's absolutely clear that the back is not lengthening and widening. So the technique is about first learning to change your own coordination of movements, and I discovered that I could not. So if I refer to the first idea of criterion, that is that you could, if your use of the self is appropriate, you should be able to change. It was obvious, at least to me, that it was not working. And I remember discussing semi-supine and the geometry and the ideas that are in semi-supine during a conference, and teachers of the modern Alexander technique were horrified by my questions. So where is the frontier between the initial Alexander technique that I teach and the modern Alexander technique? Well, it's found in the books. And that's what I said earlier, is that to my surprise, Alexander himself is contradicting his own theory of conscious guidance and control. You will see in the same chapter, just a page later, what Alexander is saying about his pupils is absolutely strange. I have found that in the process of acquiring a conscious direction of use, my pupil gradually develop a higher standard of sensory awareness or appreciation of what they are doing in the use of themselves, so that when it comes to carrying a course of activities they have decided upon, they possess a criterion within themselves which will enable them to judge whether the use they are employing is right or not for the purpose. This will constitute a criterion of self-criticism where impressions conveyed through feeling and leading to further experience are concerned. Suddenly, Alexander has changed his mind. It's not how well you're changing a problematic aspect of your behavior that is the indication or the criterion of good use. It is not the geometry of the readjustment you can apply to your own mechanism of the torso. No, suddenly it's a criterion within themselves. And it's absolutely obvious that that criterion within themselves is a feeling criterion. So the person feels what is right. The person that has been trained in the modern Alexander technique has a higher standard of sensory awareness. They can feel the many movements they are doing with the different parts of the torso. And as a result, they are able to choose the use they want. Well, if that is the case, why is it that they shorten the back? Why is it they lift the upper chest backward so that there is no way that their spine can go forward and up at the top of the torso? And as a result, they are pulling their head back. That is by choice. That is, they feel it's better. So when you present nowadays the organization of the different parts of the torso that lead to the head going forward and up to a certain number of somatic teacher, they laugh. They find it ludicrous. They consider that it's bad use. That they say the head is too far forward. So when I show them that, in fact, Alexander was using himself in this way, and that he was giving lessons to his student to obtain that form, this is, for example, the start of my explanation of where the initial Alexander technique comes from and what is the criterion we are judging. This is Alexander, so I've started to think, okay, he's promoting a certain number of movements at the same time in order to obtain a certain shape. He's not feeling this. This cannot be felt. This has to be organized. It's a very different process. And so when you look at his student, the first generation student before Patrick McDowell and Marjorie Barlow started to take control, well, you find that they are performing, they are manipulating themselves or manipulating the ideas of the different movement, the means whereby movement to obtain the lengthening, the widening, the neck free, the head forward and up, which has totally disappeared nowadays. Nowadays, giving orders, the relative values, yes, how to get the back to lengthen and widen, how to get the neck to be free or how to get the head go forward and up. It's all down with the mechanism of the torso. That's what I rediscovered reading Alexander, and I started to implement. So why is it that I could say that I have a better criterion than the somatic criterion? Well, it's not because I feel it's working. It's not because I feel better out of it. Not at all. It's not that. It's because when you organize the parts in the way Alexander constructed the architecture of his form, you find that suddenly you can solve different problems, which means you can change the way you perform simple actions. I just ask, for example, my students to sit and stand without throwing themselves forward. For example, I ask them to sit down, and I can show them on screen using the video recording as a motion system analysis. I see them, look, when you start to sit, you go forward with your knees and torso. It's your way. When you go to sit, you tend to release the ankle, so you're seen to go forward. Okay? Yes, the person can see it. And I say, in the second phase of sitting is that when you're going near the chair, suddenly it is seen that, of course, to sit on the chair, you have to move back. And what we observe for the moment is that your lower torso, your sitting bones, if you want, are projected very far back, which means that you're not really balanced when you sit on the chair, you're falling backward. It's possible to see it very simply on a video recording of any time you sit. It's not something you want, or is it something you want? Well, of course, if somebody takes the chair behind you, you're out of balance. So you are not sitting in the chair, you're falling in the chair. Would you like to change it? And the person says yes. Say, well, then you can have a new criterion in mind. It's going to be a geometrical criterion. First of all, apparently, you must inhibit the first movement you do. Because your first movement you do is to release the knees to go forward in space relatively to the ankle. And when you do that, we can see that your back is going forward, your back is not going back. So if you don't inhibit that movement, you will find that in the second phase, you have to project yourself backward. So it would be interesting, in fact, to go into a flexion that is a different flexion in which you're going to go back with the back. So that the sitting bones from the first moment you want to sit, your sitting bones are seen to move backward. And the person will say, okay, I don't know, I will try. But what is seen is that as soon as the person goes back in space with the back, so there was an expression which was back, the person is out of equilibrium. The person is falling backward. So we suddenly discover that guiding one movement of one part, refusing to do the movement of the ankle release and the knees forward, is not going to be sufficient. The person has also to compensate the movement back with the movement forward, and at best forward and up, that can be explained with the upper chest. Yes, but the person has the habit of unduly lifting the upper chest back, projecting the shoulders backward. No wonder that in these conditions, with the weight of the shoulders thrown so far back and the upper torso, as I've said, narrowed, the weight of the back is applied backward of the center of gravity of the torso. So, of course, if the person goes back with the back, the person falls. So it's necessary now for the person to disassociate the movements that feel so right. And so when the person starts to being capable of disassociating the two movements of the lower and upper torso so that the back can go back and the upper torso can go forward, then the person says, but this feels horrendous. This feels so strange. Well, yes, it may, but you apparently, when you sit now, you don't project yourself so much. You're starting to sit poised. Poise means that you keep your balance. It's a very simple test. You ask a person to sit down, you film, and you see whether at the moment of contact with the chair, the person is really directing the movements of the lower and upper torso in the correct directions. Well, the person learns to do that and discover that, well, first it's possible to direct the mind to obtain a series of movement. There are some teachers, I've seen that on the social media, that find it ludicrous, this idea of conscious guidance of a series of movements. Of course, it's too complex. Of course, it has to be left to the subconscious system. It has to be left to reflexes or to, well, these hundreds and hundreds of years of evolution. Well, in the last 2 centuries, we have changed our condition of life so much that I'm not so sure that you can bank on evolution to solve every problem. And if you just decide to not do anything, I think you're just going to stay the same and go worse. So suddenly there is this idea that the criterion of feeling is not appropriate to change habits of behavior. It's possible to use another system, which is conscious guidance and control. Yes, but Alexander explained that in the first place. How could he contradict himself so blatantly? Makes no sense. It's very, very, very strange. It's as if he was not so sure about his conscious guidance system. Because why would he plant into the mind of his pupil that they would possess a criterion within themselves after the training? I do object with this criterion within oneself. I do object with this criterion of sensory appreciation. There are so many indications everywhere you look. So let's continue with the comparison. So we have Alexander. There is a criterion for the moment. It's a geometrical criterion of the use of the mechanism of the torso. I know no other criterion. When I started to train, I knew no other criterion than this one. Because if I was to look around me and look at the teachers, the training teachers, the teachers that have a long history of knowledge. Well, when you look at them, you find that finally this straight back posture that they perform leads to a protruding abdomen, leads to invariably you can check where the sternum is orientated. It's very easy to, when you watch the person going by or performing something, you look, how is the sternum orientated? Well, it's absolutely obvious when you can see the thigh direction and you see that the direction is directed backward at the top and forward at the bottom with the abdomen protruding. Well, it's certainly not a proof that the person has a criterion within himself in order to decide what is good use. That's my problem. Yes, what is the criterion for good use? So I tended to distanciate myself from the somatic technique. Of course, I did not. I stopped teaching lying down very, very early because I found that it was obvious that there was a strong connection between the lying down criterion of lengthening and the rounded frontal plane of the torso. The fact that the chest was unduly lifted, I could see straight away if a person was a lying down person. If your person is a lying down person, you get nearly no gap between the head and the line of the back. While with Alexander, if you look at it, you will find that there is always a very, very large gap. So Alexander does not give his criterion. That's another thing, is that you must understand that we are discussing a somatic technique where people are have a criterion within themselves that they have acquired through an imprinting. And so you have to go back to the beginning and start to ask yourself the question, how did Alexander find this criterion? Because Alexander is giving ocular demonstration of a criterion. I can tell you it's impossible to reproduce what Alexander is doing without conscious guidance. He is showing a mastery in this. So the, how could he invent that? Was it a criterion within himself? He started to do a few movements and discovered that, oh yes, he was a vocalist. And the technique has been invented thanks to the fact that he was a vocalist. He was performing a certain number of movements and listening to his voice, checking whether he was getting a problem with his. Well, this made no sense, really. This construction of the technique was really difficult to accept. It didn't sound reasonable. Especially because I had some experience in the training how to get to reproduce Alexander's shape, because that was one of my great work. I mean, a personal idea that I had is that if Alexander was capable of producing these movements and showing this shape, and ocular demonstration of this shape should be able to do it. But really, I was getting nowhere. I have to admit. And I had to find something else. I had to find some clues elsewhere. And that's where I started to find them. So we are back to 1835, and François Delsarte has invented a gestural training. And his gestural training is centered on the harmonic expansion of the mechanism of the torso. So this is a picture dating just before Alexander started teaching, is 1894. This is the kind of picture you can find in a book by Giraudet. And so, well, reading Delsarte is even more difficult than reading Alexander. It's he was a Christian. He was fond of God, and everything is in fact embedded into angels and levels and things that are very difficult to follow. But he said that his criterion for the harmonic expansion of the torso, he did not invent. But yeah, I was interested straight away. No, he did not invent. He, in fact, copied. And he copied very specific sculptures. There is an architecture in sculptures. And he said that before 300 BC, well, before 300 BC is considered the golden age of the Greek era. And before, he studied for 15 years. He studied sculptures, statues, and I started to think, wow, yeah, why not me? I could study statues, because there is something in statues. Is of course, these are not human beings. These are pieces of rocks that have been worked out by somebody that was using a criterion, a very, very precise criterion of the relationship of the position of the different parts of the torso. And that was like an insight that led the rest of the development of my views on initial Alexander technique lessons, is that suddenly I realized that yes, there is a criterion, it's geometric, and there are bony parts that I could pinpoint and think, well, if I can direct the movements of these bony parts at the same time to perform a particular geometric or sculptural relation, I should get the expanding torso we are talking about. And from there, it was obvious that this was relatively easy, in fact, to implement at first. I mean, if you want a model, go and get your model and then measure your model. When your model is measured, well, you have to measure the same thing with yourself. And so you see the person that is, in fact, a young myself, using different rulers of the same length, using a vertical wall of reference, and making sure that the different spots that are the frontal plane of the torso are aligned on the instep spots. That is the Delsarte system idea of a reference, how to use the mechanism of the torso in conjunction with the mechanism of the legs. And so I did it, took a picture, took films, and then I discovered that Alexander was using the same model, the same criterion of good use. Two cases are possible. One is that they found the same thing at something like Alexander started to teach in 96. We think that he invented this in 94, while Delsarte started really to promote his new gestural system in 35. So that's 60 years or 55. So these two people, two different parts of the world, invented the same thing. Well, it's a kind of synchronicity, yes? Or Alexander was a Delsarte teacher. The difficulty is that Alexander had business cards where he says that he was a Delsarte teacher. Well, of course, most modern Alexander technique think that it was a lie on his part. He lied. I am not so sure that he lied because of these works. And so I started to observe these images and I thought, well, yes, it's possible to organize the movements of the different parts. So here, this is really static. It's using rulers again. And you think, okay, there is something in the use of the mechanism of the torso, the use of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism of the torso that looks really similar. And so from there, I went back to the principal. And this is a student. I never met him. We always had lessons on the internet. And what you can see is this young man is, in fact, using principles. He's using principles that are coordinating principles. How to organize the movement of the different parts of the torso and the different parts of the mechanism of the legs at the same time in order to get a back that is said to be lengthening and widening at the top, the middle, and the bottom, and also a head that is seen to go forward and up. Of course, for the moment, we have, specialist criterion now. This is quite nice. We see that when he goes into the flexion, is in fact tending to go back to the old mode because the hump distance is shortening here. But you should have seen him 6 months before. 6 months before, he was like me, like all the other teachers, going into monkey, going into the flexion, and protruding the abdomen forward, narrowing and shortening the back. Everything was recorded by the camera. So we consider that this criterion of use is better than the somatic one he had before, because he's now seen to change is use of the mechanism of the torso. That is the primary control of the use of the mechanism, of the whole mechanism, of the general mechanism of the self. So this is the great difference with the fact that we do not use a criterion that is the best manner of use to employ is not a criterion within himself, in the sense that he does not feel it, as it changes every time. Every day is going to use the mechanisms, so use the muscles and the ligaments, the tendon, the fascia, stretch them, so they are going to respond quite differently the next day, and the feeling is going to be different. So no feeling criterion can be a standard, because as the feeling change from day to day, this gentleman, this young man, is not using a feeling criterion within himself. What he's using is a set of rules, a set of principles, a set of models which allow him to really reason about the movements he wants to see on screen and the movement he doesn't want to see and wants to inhibit. And because he's got a criterion, because he's got a model of geometrical model of good use, what is expanding the torso, well, it's easy for him to look at his own film and observe how he is, in fact, performing the different movements. Are they appearing at the same time? Are they stopping also at the same time? And are they within the geometrical range that is defined by the model? In this way, he can continue to teach himself. This is a criterion for change. It's not a criterion of right that you have felt sometime when you were manipulated, a criterion of the past. No, we are discussing a criterion of the future. This is the initial Alexander technique.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeando.
You're welcome.
I have a few questions about this, but they're quite broad and go off in different directions. So I think we should leave that for another video.
Yeah.
But,
if you can send me your questions.
Okay. Yeah. People listening, so please send any questions you have for Jeando. There's a lot of interesting stuff there about the origins of the Alexander technique. And if you want to book a lesson with Jeando, you'll find a link to his website underneath. And we'll see you in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin.